Hello and welcome. I think the idea here is for us to be able to, play around with two-factor authentication and basically understand how it works, right? So I feel I've actually gotten a couple of requests regarding this, and I feel it's actually high time I kind of walk you guys through how it works under the hood, right? And yeah, so this is actually the demo of the app. So I'm just going to create an account. It's actually the login screen. Click on create account, and this is going to be, let's call this guy John Doe, right? So let's do johndoe@gmail.com. Let's give it a password, maybe a nice one, and John Doe it. Okay, so let's restart this user. So we basically have the little preloaded there. Then we have this user John Doe it. Gonna save that. And this user does not basically have any two-factor authentication. I think he can basically just log into his account. Good. So now we are in John Doe's account. You can see we have a couple of recovery codes. We have valid codes. We have use code. So recovery codes is actually very cool when you don't have, or when you've actually lost any means to basically verify your device via two-factor authentication. You can actually use a recovery code. So recovery code is something that you can actually keep within yourself, probably keep the file somewhere safe, and you can use it to basically log in at any point in the future, right? So you can actually use one of the codes once, and once it's used, you can reuse it. So this is a recovery code. I'm going to click on this recovery codes. So you can actually see these are actually all of my recovery codes. I can use this to log in the case where I basically have like 2FA enabled and stuff like that. So you can copy this code, right? I just copied it. Let's look for a way to paste it. Just going to paste it there. This is the code. You can print it if you want. This is me printing it. And this is it right here. So you can just connect your printer to it and have it printed. Then you can actually, download it. This is it right here. This is the downloaded format of it. So now this works very similar compared to what we have in GitHub, right? So if you have a GitHub account, when you set up your recovery code or you have any form of two-factor authentication, this is the way it works. And also, maybe you've actually exhausted a couple of your recovery codes and you want to restore this code. So if I click on this button, it's going to regenerate a new 16 pair for this code. So I'm going to click on it. You can see it's regenerated. We have new codes every time, right? So if you have anyone that is reused, it's just going to generate a new 16 pair for you. Right, so I'll show you in a bit on how you can actually use this, but now I need to set up 2FA. So I click on the setup 2FA button. So now I'm just going to go on my phone and try to use Google Authenticator to authenticate. Right, so this is it. Scan QR code. Twofactor, and I have my phone over here, so I'm just going to try to record my screen now and have that. So click on that. Okay, so you can just use your Google Authenticator, click on this button, then scan the QR code. Okay, now I should be able to have a couple of things, right? So I have 101 then 872. So you want to just activate that. Now we are activated, right? So which is a good thing. So now that we are activated, we can just try to log out now. And whenever we want to log in again, I'm being asked to input the 6-digit verification code. So now I'm just going to enter 020 then 696. So let's activate that. Boom, I'm in, right? So this way you basically have access to everything you want to use within the actual platform, right? So I think that's actually the good thing about it. And there are cases where you don't actually, for some reason, have access to this 2FA account, right? So in that case, that's where we basically have a kind of a different layer, which is the recovery code. So now I basically have this. I'm just going to, I think I've already downloaded a copy of this, but let's see if it's the same. 18284. Okay, definitely. So I have this copy already. So now, for example, I'm just going to use this first one to log in. So I'm going to copy that and try to log out. Log out. I come in here, show my password, paste it. So I just pasted that as my password. I should be able to use this recovery code to access the account once, and after that it shouldn't work, right? So let me use the login. Boom, I'm in, which is a good thing. So now if you check your recovery codes, you can see that this one is now used. You can use it again. So if I tend to use it again, I'm going to log out and show password, and let's grab the exact same thing, which is this. I'm going to copy it and paste it right in here. So when I log in, it doesn't work anymore, right? Because it has been used. They can use it twice, right? So that's why we basically have a scene pair that you can definitely use. So I think this is what we'll be building, and yeah, so let's get right into it. Okay, so this is actually how it works. You can actually go straight to this repo. I'll drop a link down below, right? And so what we are doing here, it's quite a couple of things, right? So I've actually added a picture of the architectural pattern I've taken in this course, so that you guys can basically get a proper understanding of it. So now what we're going to do, we're going to drop just jump into the canvas real quick. So now this is something that we have already, right? So we have a little input collector here as our login page. So now we'll normally just takes in the the email, the password. So when we're taking the email and the password, the very first thing we do, we tend to validate the password if it's actually a recovery code for that user, right? So we're actually leveraging Next.js server actions for this. And if you don't know what server actions are, they're just a little piece of actions you can actually include in Next.js, and this action can actually be called in or within your client code, as the case may be. So sometimes you basically have the app folder, and within the app folder there's like this API directory. So just something like this, right? So you basically have like app folder. I'm just going to remove that real quick. So we have the app folder, right? So within the app folder, there's something called a different API, like a different API folder. So you basically have this API. So let me use small letter real quick. Yes, so yeah, we have this API. So everything within your API can actually be a folder, depending on how you want to structure it. So you can have something like maybe login, which is the folder, and then you can now have something like route.cs. So this is a structure that Next.js basically imbibe or stay with. With this way, you can actually do something like /API/login to be able to access the login route. So within this route, it can tend to actually use some little piece of function, and these functions can actually communicate directly with your models and stuff like that. And also at the top of it, it has the use server directive. So that actually kind of register it as a server action, right? So these are actually ways for you to be able to communicate with your model and being able to use it as and when required. So back to this, we basically check if it's actually, if what you have is a server action, if it's actually recovery code, right? So now we have two possibilities here. Is either is the password you enter is a recovery code or not, right? So if it is a recovery code, right, we tend to just call the login user server action. I'll show you this in a bit. It's actually within the code. So we call the login user server action, and then we generate a JWT token, right? So this is what we do in the case of validating that the recovery code entered is actually an active recovery code, right? So that's actually it for the process flow. If it's actually yes. So if it is no, on the other end, if it is not a recovery code or is not active, as the case may be, the very next thing we do, we actually call the get to FA status by email, right? So this user's email right here, we'll pass it into this little server action. And what it's going to do behind the scenes is going to check if we basically have, if that user already has like, it has already like set up a 2FA within the application, right? So now there are two possibilities to this, as I said before as well. So it's either it hasn't set up a 2FA kind of authorization, or it has set maybe a particular 2FA, right? So we basically have no yes. So if it is no, it hasn't set a 2FA, it just, go all the way to basically call the login user server action. There it tends to log in the user and generate the JWT token if the credentials are valid. So in the case where this user, basically has like, 2FA status enabled, as the case may be. So what we do in this case is that we actually generate a kind of a 6-digit verification token using platforms like Google Authenticator or Authy to basically, verify this, right? So that's why on the system, you get to basically, trigger you to enter this code, and this code can actually be on your mobile or some sort of emulator you're using, right? And I'm going to demo this real time in a bit. So now this is actually the architectural pattern of our login, right? So now there's actually a different section to this, and this has to do with the 2FA setup. So when you're actually setting up your 2FA for the first time, we're actually leveraging a library called SpeakEasy, right? I don't know if you guys have heard of it before, but it's actually a very cool library, SpeakEasy. So this is actually the actual route. You can check it out if you want. So this is the actual library, and yeah, so this is it. So you can just install it by using this command, and then we're going to play around with it a bit. Okay, so now we go back. So when we generate that, we need to verify that this kind of key is valid, right? So when you generate, it's going to give you a base 32 secret. So this base 32 secret, we're going to save it within our DB, right? And we're going to save it within our DB so that we can actually make reference of it in the future, right? So I'm going to show you an example real quick. So this, I'm going to take this here to the right. Okay, take this to the left. Okay, so now you can see from what we have here, this is the model structure of our 2FA. So we have a secret, we have a user ID, we have a status, and so on. So now think of it this way. This base 32 secret is what we have here. This is the secret we have here. This is what the user can subsequently use to verify himself. If for example, he basically misplaces his phone or something like that, he can use this secret to be able to, re-authenticate through the platform again, right? So it has a secret. So this is a secret that has been used to generate that code, right? So this code is what we get from the Google Authenticator or Authy, as the case may be. And then this code, we basically have a separate server action, which is called verify 2FA secret. So this server action is only responsible for verifying this token entered, right? So to make sure that this token entered, basically it is a valid token, right? So now what this server action does under the hood is that it communicates with SpeakEasy and passing the token that we just got here, as well as the base 32, this secret that the user basically has, and see if it matches. If it does match, it just authenticates the user, but if it doesn't, it just throws an error. So I think this is actually how it works. And yeah, I think enough of the talks. We want to actually get into the actual implementation of things real quick. All right, so I've created a little API service. So this is what we'll actually be using to communicate with our endpoint, right? So we're using Next.js to basically run both the client side as well as the the server side using server actions. Right, so now we basically have this little make API call service. It takes in the URL and a bunch of options. So these options can actually be the method and the body in the case of post, put, and so on, and patch, I think. Right, so I think we're just using all these ones for the time being. Right, so what we're doing here is we're basically setting the headers, putting the content type, and yeah, doing some sort of authorization if we have a token, right? And then we basically, await fetch, fetch the URL to be able to, pass in all of this to it and stuff like that. So here you can actually use Axios if you want. So it's not like it's not set in stone to basically just use fetch, right? So you can use Axios if you prefer that. For most of bigger projects, you want to definitely use Axios, by the way, not fetch. right? So yeah, but just for this demo purposes, we are using fetch to make the actual request. And I think I'm just going to scale this up a bit so you guys can see it, right? So when we do this, when we have a proper OK response, right, and then we can actually just return the data. But if we don't have an OK response, we tend to do a couple of other things, right? So we check if the JWT has expired via the message, right? So if it has expired, we try to reload or redirect the user to the login page, right? So, and also we still give a toast that says, oh, your token has just expired and stuff like that. This gives a better understanding, a better feel to the user of what is actually going on. All right. So if, for example, there was some sort of error that must have happened within all of this process, we actually use the catch block to handle that, right? So we emit out the error via toast to the user, and then we just return null. So that means this function should end already, right? So that's completely fine. And also, this is actually our service. And I think the next part, I'm going to go to library and go to actions, right? So these actions is where we basically have our respective server actions, right? So I'm going to go through them one after the other. And also we have our database setup. In the database setup, we have the connection, we have the models and stuff like that. So let's look first into the connections. So we're using Mongoose, leveraging Mongoose to basically communicate with our MongoDB, right? So now what you want to do, if you don't basically know how to do this for the first time, I'm just going to disconnect out of this. You can install MongoDB Compass, right? So just Google it. There are actually free resources online for you to be able to install the Compass. It's very easy. And what you want to do, you can just create a new connection and call your database anything you want, like anything you want, like anything, right? It doesn't need to be this. So anything you want to call your DB, you can just connect to it. So now you basically have the anything you want. So you can copy the connection string, go to your env, and you want to just paste it in here, right? So this, in your own case, this should be what you have, right? So this just gives you an instance, your own cluster of of MongoDB basically. So I'm going to undo that real quick. Go to Mongoose. So now that you already have this, you know how to get this using the MongoDB Compass, right? So I'm going to show you how you can basically connect with this database, right? So now if you notice what we're actually using here, we're actually using a process referred to as singleton. So what singleton does is that it allows you to create only one instance of a connection and not multiple, right? So if you have a connection already created before now, right, it's going to use the instance of that connection. So there's no point creating multiple connections at the same time because that leads to, memory leaks. It's a very common problem. So that's why if you are connected to a DB or do anything that has to do with a connection, an every connection, you basically want to connect to it once and only once, basically. So you don't want a situation whereby you have like 10 different instances of a DB connection opened for you, because this actually leads to future bugs and problems. All right, so there we go. So we're using SQL to basically, check if it's already cached. If we already have it, we just return what we already have. But if we don't, we just want to create a new instance of this connection, right? So we'll connect, just do the new instance of the connection and return that, right? So this is what we are doing here. So you specified your DB name. As I was saying earlier, your DB name can actually be anything you want, right? So you can see the 2FA security app I have here. It's because of the fact that I named my DB 2FA security app. So if, for example, you name your DB, I think in this case, the connection string I use an example is anything you want. So I'm just going to copy the anything you want from here and paste it here. So this will be your own DB name if you are using the anything you want as a connection string, right? So I think with this, you can be able to have a proper connection setup. So this basically are all the codes you need for you to be able to have a very production ready kind of connection with Mongoose, right? So I think I'm going to go over this one more time so that it's actually clear. So we're actually leveraging singleton to to make sure that the connection only exists once and we don't create multiple instances of the connection. So if the connection has not existed before now, we just create a new connection for it, and then we basically return that. All right. So this is exactly the flow as it stands now. And also the next step has to do with our models, right? So we have a couple of models, and yeah, so the way it works is we basically define some sort of schema for our models, right? So for the user model, we have the email, we have the full name, we have the password, we have the suspended, right? So these are all the fields that needs to be filled by a user, right? Before he or she can actually create an account, right? So now if you notice, we have the suspended here. Suspended is actually, default is false. Users can actually choose not to fill this, right? So it's not meant for the user to be filled. This has to be some sort of administrative controls and stuff like that, right? So yeah, so I think this makes sense. So we have the email, the full name, the password, and so on. So right now we actually set timestamps to true. What this does is that if you check your DB, just going to open up the user models, user table, you can see we have the created at and updated at. So what this timestamps true does is it includes these two fields for you automatically, right? It includes this created at and updated at. So you don't need to define it manually. Right, that being said, this is how the user model is. And one of the things you need to be very careful of when defining your model is that use the same name all through, right? So there are cases where you may actually have an issue where you say, oh, this is a different thing. Give this one a different whatever. And you give this one maybe something else like this and maybe something else like this. Is going to be a pure disaster. It doesn't work for the most part. And it's actually advisable in the docs for you to keep all the names pretty consistent. So you have a user here, do models.user. Model, this is the user model. Then you pass in the schema you just defined above into it, and then you return this user, right? So you just have to export that user. You get the idea, right? So if, for example, this is another valid one, so I can say Xavi, right? So Xavi, come here, just export Xavi. So this would be a very good model demonstration for Xavi, right? So make sure that the name you gave to it are all consistent, right? So that makes sense. Okay, so now let's go over to the 2FA model. We're going to close that, go to 2FA model. So the 2FA model on the other end takes in the user ID. This is the user. This is actually a reference to the user model, right? So it takes in this user ID. It takes in the secret, as I showed earlier, and then it takes in the status. And also, we still have the timestamps passed into it. So if I check it again, I'm going to click on this, go to 2FA. So you can see we have the user ID, which is the reference of the user table. We have the secrets, which is what we have here as a string. And then we have a status, which is actually a Boolean, right? So I think default, it can actually, allow no can be false. That means it's actually, very much required. So default is actually false, right? So this is how the structure of the 2FA schema looks like. And yeah, that's it. And we can actually go over to recovery code model. The recovery code model on the other end takes something very similar with what we have in 2FA, right? So the only difference is that this takes in code, right? So 2FA, the recovery codes are those long, I think 8 pair of codes, like 16 altogether, right? That we basically have that you can use to recover your account in case you lose access to your two-factor authentication app or stuff like that. So now you can see the way we are defining it. We take in the user, make a reference to the user model. We take in the actual code. We take in whether it is active or inactive, right? So we pass in the timestamp. This allows us to have the created at and the updated at field, right? So both fields will be present when you specify this. And also we come in here to basically do to define the model, right? So we have the models, the recovery code. As I said before, everything has to be consistent. What you use here should be what you use here, should be what you use here. Then pass in your schema right into it. This should be able to make it work for you without errors, right? So this is actually the schematics of how the models are actually aligned. And just to recap, we basically have the user model, we have the 2FA model, we have the recovery code models, right? So with this, I think we can actually move on to the actual thing, right? So I'm going to go into, first off, I'm going to explain how the endpoints work, right? From there, we can actually move into the client code. So for the endpoint, we basically have a couple of them. As you can see here, we have the login, we have the profile, we have the recovery codes, we have the register, we have the 2FA, we have 2FA by email, right? So now we're going to go through them one at a time, right? So first of all, let's go to register, because first things first, you need to register a user. So you click on this, you click on the route, as I said before, because this actually is /API/register route. So click on the route.ts and you're going to have access to this. All right, so we're back to the register route, and also the way we do, we create some sort of validations. So I'm going to open this in a separate tab, right? So for you to be able to, register a user, we're taking a couple of inputs, right? So I'm going to go here, go to the register page. No thanks. So we're taking the full name, we're taking the email, we're taking the password, right? So these are the things we're taking. And if you check now, in the validations that we have, we're taking the full name, we're taking the email, and then we're taking the password. So we are using Zod to basically validate all of this input. So we have a much more, solid kind of validation, right? So we're taking all of this input, and then we're basically checking if the full name basically has a minimum of at least 3 characters, right? So if the max, if it has a maximum of like 50 characters and stuff like that. So if I come here and I do something like CC, which is like 2, it's not up to 3, click on register, it said full name must be at least 3 characters, right? So this is actually very good validations right there. Maybe this one, I want to put in a lot of values. You can see we have like full name must be at most 50 characters. So you can see these validations are actually something real cool. So for example, I don't want to pass in a valid email, just do something like this. It's going to be caught right here, right? So yeah, basically have the password, the same thing apply here. So if for example, I just needed 1, 2, 3, this is not a valid password, as the case may be, because it's not up to 8 characters. So we can actually train some other validations here to make it stronger, maybe require some sort of special cases and stuff like that. These are the things you can do to improve the security of your apps. And also one thing that is actually much more preferred is that most of the time add a kind of visualizer here down here and say, password requires at least a special character, it must be at least 8 characters and so on. That way your user might be able to, be able to picture how to structure the actual password. Right, so we have the full name, we have the email, and then we have the password. Good. So now what we are doing, we are using this, we're importing this, and then we are using the safe pass. They will pass in the body, and the body is actually request.json, right? So this the entire body is what we have there, like the full name and so on, right? So now we're going to have access to this. If there's form of any error, we'll try to catch it using this particular logic to catch, right? So if there's if it's not successful, if the validation is not successful, we return this, which is more of all the time before 100 error bar request, and then we return the actual validation error right there, right? So yeah, so after that, we want to actually communicate with the create user server action, right? So now we'll call this. So if everything is okay, we just create that user. So now let's go into the create user server action. So this is actually the create user server action. So what we are doing here, first off, we'll try to put in there the use server. This actually registers this as a server action, right? And we'll connect with the database. And remember, we're actually using the singleton, to basically keep one instance of the database connection, so we don't have multiple instances, thereby leading to memory leaks and stuff like that, right? So we'll connect to the DB. So we'll check if this user email already exists. So if it already exists, we cannot use that email to create a user anymore. So we just return this error. User with this email already exists, right? So if it's not the case, we can just set a password, tend to hash that user's password. We are using this hash from bcrypt. right? So basically hash the user password, and also you can actually, use some sort of secret here, but now I think I'm just using 10 for the sort, right? So over it takes in the data, it takes in the sort or rounds, as the case may be, right? So you can actually make this much more secure, but for the sake of this lesson, we're just going to stick with this as it works. All right, so we have the new user, so we can now create the user. Now we don't have the hashed password of the user. So that means when we create the user, we are going to have a corresponding hashed equivalent of that user's password and not the plain password. So if I go into the user model now, you can see the password now is now hashed. Right? So this is the hashed user password and not the actual password entered by the user. Right? So this is how you do that. You hash the password, and before you save it into the DB, you don't want to save in raw password, which doesn't, actually make any sense, right? So if you do that, you're actually exposing, your platform to some sorts of bugs, attacks, and overall security malware. All right. So now this is the way we basically create our user. So we can go back. So we'll do this. If everything is good, we create this user, and then we return a created user just like this. Right? So this is the created user, and we'll send this as the response to the endpoint. Right. So this is how we basically register a user. And I feel this basically explains this. And let's go to login. I'm gonna close this out, close this, and go to the login route. So as you see in the login, we're taking something very similar to what we are doing in register, but in this case we are taking in the login user input validation. We're going to open this out. So login input validation takes in email and password, right? So email, we are validating if it's an actual email. It has at least a minimum of 2 characters and stuff like that, because if it is less than 2, that means it's not a valid email, by the way. And then we actually check if it meets the email regis specification by using the .email, right? So we're taking the email and then the password. So let's check the actual app. I'm going to go to login. I'm going to just close this out. So now let's do X login. So this actually requires email, right? You can see that we basically have to put in an actual email there. But then let's put in password. Let's just do like C login. Password must be at least 8 characters. You can see here, password must be at least 8 characters, right? So enter a valid email. You might not be able to see this because the input used in the form is type email. That means that's an HTML generic property to validate email fields, right? So input fields as email. Okay, so this actually makes sense considering the technicalities. And we're just taking the email, we're taking the password, and then we'll pass this into this stuff, and then we'll try to safe parse it with the body, right? So if what we have in the body is able to meet all the criteria for our login user input validation, it returns a successful response. But if that's not the case, it returns some sorts of validation errors here and there. And yeah, so if it's actually validated successfully, we go to this next line, and then we want to go to, we call the login user server action, right? So this is in library actions and user. So open this up. Okay, I'm going to take this out. Okay, so this is what we do. We connect to the DB, which is okay. So we basically check if that user email already exists. If it does not exist, we just return invalid email, right? So if it does exist, you know what we are doing? We are doing a couple of things here, right? So remember, on login, we check if the password is a recovery code, is a valid recovery code. So if you go back to our actual specification, and let's open this up. So you can see this is the login architecture. When you have your email and then you have your password, I'm going to take this to the right a bit. Yes, let's do this. Okay, so let's put this here. Okay, good. Okay, so as you can see here, if the password is actually, we check the validity of the password as unused recovery code for the user. This is what we are doing here. So we tend to process the recovery code for the signing to check if this password is an actual recovery code. If it is, we generate a token and return that token. So this token is a JWT token that expires in the next 3 hours, right? So now we can actually come in here and check process recovery code for signing. So let's open up this server action and see what it does. Right, so this is a server action. So we just connect to DB as usual, check the email, then we basically check the code against the user ID, right? So recovery code basically has the user ID field, and this is the code that we just passed in. So in this code is actually the password, as the case may be, that the user entered in this case, right? So this is the password of the user, and then this is the user ID. So when you check this, first of all, check if it has an ID, right? So if it does have an ID, we tend to go in here. So we check if it is not active, right? So if it is not active, we want to set it to active, right? And then we want to actually do something else here, which is very interesting. So what this should return, returns a promise of a boolean, and it returns whether the recovery code exists or not. So in that case, we basically need to return if it's true or false. By doing this, we basically have, forcefully coerce it to return the actual value. So active by default is false from the specification of the code. But if you do this, it returns true, saying that, oh, okay, that means this code has not been used before. It is not really active, but then it can actually be used now. Right, so you can actually simplify this depending on how you want to basically handle it. It depends on each individual use case. But definitely this is what we have. This approach. And yeah, so when you do this, it's going to, this ensure that you cannot be able to use the same code multiple times, right? So this ensures a singular code cannot be used multiple times, right? Only once. Okay, so yeah, so this basically just ensure that you can use that code more than once, right? So because we basically update the active status of that code right in here, right? So now we go back to our user action, we process this. As I explained before, if everything turns out well, we tend to generate a token and pass that to the client, right? Okay, so now if this is not the case, that means the password is obviously a normal user password. The very next thing we do, as you can see, this is what we are doing. So the very next thing we do, we check if the password, we compare the hash of the password, right? So you can use Bicrypt to do that comparison by specifying the password they just entered with the actual hash password of the user. So if there's a match, if there is no match, we return invalid credentials. But if there is a match, we just generate a token and return the token to the client, right? So I think it's very easy given the systematic approach to it. And this is exactly how we are able to undo our login user server action, right? So server action you have here is that we are able to basically, undo it. Okay, good. So we've been able to explain the register and then the login, right? So now let's go into the profile. Let's understand what controls the profile. I'm going to open a profile, go to routes.ts, we'll close this real quick. So now this is what we have. So we basically have, so now we're validating the token. The token is coming from the request, right? So the way we do this, it's very simple. I think I've explained it before, is that we try to get in the headers, we tend to get the value of the authorization within the header, right? So whatever value you have there should be your token, right? So this token, we have to basically validate it to make sure that it's a valid token, right? So we don't want a situation whereby a non-authenticated user is able to access the platform freely, right? So this actually leads to lots of security breach and stuff like that. So we don't really need situations like this. So now we've written a custom validate token relative function, I think, right? It's a utility. So I'm going to open it up. So there we go. This is actually our validate token function. So you can see what we are doing here. We are validating the JWT token, right? So we pass in the token and we have to basically decode it to make sure that, oh, it is nice, it contains some sort of user ID or whatever. So this is how we basically decode it right here, right? So we do JWT.verify, you pass in the token. Many a time I noticed that the token basically contains something similar to this, bearer, then your token. It can actually be EY, yeah, something like that. So your token basically contains this, and that's the more reason you basically need to, split it. So when you split, it's going to give you something like this. It's going to give you an array or something like this, right? So it's going to give you an array of this. So if you notice, we are splitting by the space. That's the space in between here and here. It's going to give you bearer, and it's going to give you this remaining part, right? So this is an array. So if you want to get the second element in an array, you basically have to put in the index 1. So all indexes in JavaScript basically starts with index 0. If you want to get bearer, you want to do this, then pass in the 0 index, just like the way we're doing here. So, but if you want to get this, you want to pass in the 1 index, just like the way we are doing here, right? So this way, it allows you to have access to just this token, this part of things. Okay, so now good for us, right? So if you notice, we also pass in the JWT secret, right? So this JWT secret is, if you notice what we did earlier, I'm going to put it down. So when we're actually, creating our user, going to go here, this login user, right? So we have JWT secret and stuff like that. Yeah. So now, if you notice, when you log in a user, we use a secret to generate that token, right? So the same token, the same secret is what we'll be using. So I think in this code, we're just using secret. So you can use something more secured with special characters and stuff like that, right? So you can actually use things that are more secure in that case. So you could come in there. So we are using that same secret to try to decode it, right? Because if you specify a different secret here, there's going to be some mismatch, and that mismatch will render the entire thing completely unusable. So you don't need a situation like that. So now, once you pass in your token, you pass in your secret. So it's going to basically, right, so we have a callback here, right? So if it's actually an error, it throws an error message. But if it works as expected, it's going to return this, this payload, right? So if your token is valid and stuff like that and matches what we have in your secret, it's going to return this payload, right? So at the end of the function, we just return the decoded token, which is actually an instance of this payload, basically. So this is how you can actually use this validate token to take care of every token you have within the app, so that when you access some endpoint like get user by ID or stuff like that, it is actually, it already knows, the user ID that you're targeting from your token, right? So that creates a proper idea of how it should work. Okay, so now that is actually out of the way, we already know that the user ID is part of the validated token. So part in the user ID. So we have a server action called get user by ID. So I'm going to open up the server action now. And there we go. This is it. So what it does is, all server action connects to DB, which is understandable. So we'll find one by using the Mongoose find one method to basically find, a single entry, right? So we're passing the ID there. And no, notice what we are doing here. We don't want to include password, right? So if you want to even fetch the user, we don't want password field included. We know the password is already hashed, which is a good thing. But at the same time, we don't want a situation whereby the hashed password is being sent over to the client, right? So it's not safe to expose this kind of sensitive information. So that's why we basically have the minus sign to negate the password field, right? So we fetch this, it's going to give you all the user elements, excluding the password field, right? So this is exactly how it works. You can read more about the select method, right? So it comes in handy when you want to achieve a couple of things like this. So after that, we basically get the response from here. We want to stringify that response and pass it. So when we pass it, we'll pass it over to the client. So this is exactly how the get user by ID server action works. Okay, so once we have a value from there, we have the user object from there, we just send that user over to here, and then we return this as our response. Right, so this is exactly how you can actually play around with getting user information by hitting the endpoint /API/profile right here. Okay, so I'm going to close out all of this so we can move over to the next one. So we've explained the login, we explained the register, we explained the profile. So let's go over to 2FA. Okay, so there are a couple of sensitive informations here for the 2FA, and we're going to explain them one at a time. All right, so yes, so for the 2FA, there are a couple of things we want to look into, right? So we have a generate 2FA server action, and yeah, so we have the verify 2FA server action, we have the get 2FA by user ID, and also we have the delete 2FA, right? So this is actually, I think, is relevant when a user wants to remove his 2FA, right? So, okay, so we're going to go through them one after the other. I think I've already explained some of the processes of how all this work, right? So first off, we'll try to get a token, right? The token, we already know the format of the token. It has, PRI, EY, and so on, right? So when we're trying to validate it, we try to split it, get the actual token, and then try to use the .verify method from Bicrypt to be able to I think from JSON Web Token to be precise. Yes, yeah, the verify method from JSON Web Token, JWT. Yeah, right. So we can definitely use that to try to verify the user's token, right? So given the secret key and stuff like that. So we have the 2FA. So here we are actually communicating with generate 2FA. So I'm going to open up the server action now. And in here, as we already know, we basically need to communicate or connect with the actual DB. And the next thing we do, we check if the user already has 2FA activated by using this, right? So we put in the user ID, we just check if the status is true, right? So if we're able to get a 2FA with this, that means the user already has like 2FA enabled, so you cannot really generate a new one, right? So this is actually an extra security measure to make sure that we don't generate 2FA secret for twice, right? So twice, so we don't need a situation like that. We just want to be able to generate it at least once. Right, so go in here, validate token. Okay, so I'm gonna close that out, go back to 2FA. Okay, not sure why it's complaining. Okay, return any, return result. Okay, all right, so let's forget about that for now, go about that later. Generate 2FA. Okay, so when we check this, when we're done checking this, we want to use Speakeasy to generate a secret. Like I said before, the secret that we're generating, we just want the base 32 representation of the secret key. Because what it does is that it gives us enough privilege to be able to use this in some top level applications like Google Authenticator or Authy, as the case may be. Right, so this gives us a better approach like that. So when we have our secret, the next thing we do, we try to get the 2FA by user ID, right? So what we want to do here, there's a server action already, get 2FA by user ID. This is just what we do, right? So it's just a small function that we use to get 2FA by the user ID. Okay, so Now that you already have this, so if you already have this, it's just going to return the secret for you. But if you do not have, 2FA before, which is this is the first time you are creating it, it's just going to you're going to create a new one. So a new one with the user ID as well as the secret. So what we need for the secret is the base 32 representation. I always call this 62 for some weird reason, but it's actually base 32 representation of the secret. Right. So with this, we have access to the generate 2FA, right? And yeah, that's all we need. Right, so the front end can basically play around with a couple of all of this. You just need to send this through. Right, so I'm going to route. So now, when we have a proper 2FA, we just send it over to the response with the status code 201. Right, I don't know why this is complaining. Let me just look into it, by the way. I'll just put any here for now. Right, apply proper type to it later. Okay, still complaints. That's weird. It wasn't like that before. Okay, I'm gonna debug this real quick. Maybe promise of any for now. Strangely, so that how it works now. I'm not sure why it didn't work as I expected before, which it should actually. Okay, we can come back to that later on. Okay, so this is exactly how you want to understand the generate 2FA, for the most part. And if you scroll down a bit, we have the verify 2FA. Right, so the way verify 2FA works, if I go back to the semantics now, when you verify 2FA, we're actually calling this verify 2FA server action. And the way it works, I'm just going to open it up. Okay, so first off, we'll connect to the DB. And the other thing is that we want to get the user 2FA, right? So we want the status to actually be either true or false. Doesn't really matter for us. We just need it to belong to that user. And if it is not, if we don't really have a 2FA for that user, what we do, we can just say secret key is invalid, because that could actually be the only reason why we are not able to get a proper 2FA for that user. Okay, so the next thing we do, we verify the token against the secret. So we're using speakeasy, as I said before. So I think this is actually a native function I created here called speakeasy verified. We pass in the secret as well as the token to this function. So let's see what that function does. So now we connect as usual. So we're using speakeasy.totp.verify, to basically check in a couple of things, right? So what we are passing in here, we're passing the secret, we're passing in the encoding as base 32, right? So if you remember, when we're creating this, we were actually creating it with the base 32 representation. So if we want to encode, we do the same thing, right? And then we pass in the token, right? So the token is actually what you get from your authenticator application. So assuming this is actually Google Authenticator, sorry. Yeah, so assuming this is Google Authenticator, right? So this is actually what Google Authenticator will give to you. This 6-digit, whatever is this? Is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Actually, that is 7. Okay, so Google is going to give you this 6-digit, and this 6-digit or auth, as the case may be. Let's not be biased now. So you can use Google Authenticator, or you can use auth. There are lots of applications you can use. Okay, so depending on the one you're using, they're going to give you this kind of representation. And this token, this 104567, is the actual token to specify your window and so on. So this will be responsible for verifying your token against your base 32 secret you saved before, right? So go back here. You can say, so if it's verified, it returns a boolean, either true or false. So if it's not verified, we know that, the OTP is indeed invalid, right? So That's the only reason that could happen. So if it is invalid, we just return invalid OTP, try again. But if it is not, we try to set the status to true. We put the secret to the actual secret and so on. So one thing that is very important to note here is that we already have, we already have the secret. We can as well just take this out. But the thing that is not has not done here is that the status by default is actually false. But for now, we're going to set it to true in this case. And then, yeah. So after that, we're just going to get the 2FA by the user ID. Then we'll get all the updated 2FA configuration for that specific user. Right. So this is exactly how you play around with the verified 2FA. We'll go back to utils. I'm going to enlarge this a bit. Go to the route. Okay. So we have the get 2FA by user ID. This is very simple. As I said before, we get a token, we validate the token, we'll get the user ID from that validated token, and then we'll consume or we'll call the get 2FA by user ID server action. Right. So what this does is that it just uses the Mongoose find one method to get the 2FA representation of that user's two-factor authentication. Right. So that should work by default for the most part. Right, and take after that, we have the delete 2FA. So delete 2FA is, I think, is very important. Depends on how you want to really do this. In some cases, I've seen situations where you want to, allow the user to put in a 2FA token for that user to be able to deactivate his two-factor authentication. But in some other cases, this is not really advisable because if a user wants to deactivate, probably they just lost access to their 2FA app or account. And as a result, they are not able to directly have this token. So it becomes a kind of a dilemma for that user to be able to remove this kind of extra security layer from the app. Right. So for us to not to have that kind of issue, we tend to just allow them to remove the 2FA within the settings app in the actual application, because that way we just save them enough stress going forward. Okay, so now we can actually check out delete 2FA server action. So what we do, we connect as usual, and we have the get 2FA by ID, which I've already explained. And if there is no 2FA, you just say, oh, you do not have 2FA enabled. There's no point trying to deactivate what you don't have enabled. So if we do have, we just want to use the delete one method to remove it from our system. So using the delete one method is going to come over here and remove this entry, right? So if I'm deleting this, it's just going to remove the entire entry from the DB, right? So if I'm deleting this, the same thing will happen. Okay, so I think now I've been able to explain the entire processes that it takes, right? Starting from generate 2FA to verifying to retrieving as well as deleting. So now we can actually properly manage our two-factor authentication. So one other thing is more of like an extended branch to two-factor. We have the two-factor by email, right? So here we have two call endpoints. One is for you to be able to get 2FA by email. So why this is actually extremely important is when the user is trying to get into the system, we want to be able to get his 2FA status, right? So if you notice, we already have something similar in our design. I'm just going to remove all of this. So if you come in here and see, right? So if we check that the validity of the password is not a recovery code, we use the server action to basically get the 2FA status by email, right? So this is the endpoint basically responsible for that action, right? So we have the get 2FA by email server action. I'm going to open it up. So we'll connect to DB, we retrieve the user by email, right? And then we'll pass this user ID to the 2FA to be able to see, oh, if this user already has like a 2FA enabled before now. Right, so I think with that, we can be able to, do this on login, which is very good. And also we have the verified 2FA token by email, right? So this one, It's very important in a way, but it's not that like extremely important, right? So I think we were using it in some parts of it, and the way it works is connects to DB, gets that user by email, and it tries to find the 2FA entry for that user ID. And what it's going to do is going to communicate with Speakeasy to see if it's able to verify. So if it's not able to verify, it returns invalid OTP. But if it's able to basically verify this, it returns true, right? Which is understandable, right? So this way, we basically know that, oh, this is our email basically has like 2FA enabled or not, given that you've supplied the appropriate token. Okay, so now I think this is actually, with this, we've come to the end of, basically explaining how 2FA by email works, right? I think the only thing we've not really covered here has to do with the recovery codes, right? So the recovery codes are basically very little entries, and the way you understand them is what we're doing. We are using some sort of nano ID to generate a bulk representation of the codes, right? So if we have 8 pairs, that means we have 16 codes. So these 16 codes can actually be used only once by the user. So if you use a code once, we prevent you from using that code subsequently. This creates some sort of integrity within the system, preventing abuse as much as it can. So what we're going to do, we're going to go through the process of creating bulk recovery codes, to getting recovery codes for signing, to get all recovery codes. So we have like 3 touch points that we'll actually be explaining. Okay, so let's go for the first one, bulk create recovery codes. So how do we do this, right? So what we do, we validate the token and we call the bulk create recovery codes several actions. So I'm going to open this up. Okay, so what we do here is very interesting. You have to really take note of this. So if you want to create a bulk recovery code, we first of all generate recovery codes, right? So this function to generate recovery codes I think it's very important, to be honest. And why it's important is, I'm going to open it up real quick. So you can see what we are doing here. We have codes push, the user ID, then the code. So we are using UUID, but we're just doing some splitting and stuff like that to be able to get, I think, just 5 letters of the UUID. Let's be sure about that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, okay. I think what we are doing is we are splicing. We slice it, and if you check your UUID now, it basically has some long representation, and sometimes it has some dashes. So we want to grab the first 5, right? So maybe the first 5 here, and get the first 5 here as well. So we actually bring it together by using the hyphen to make a separation in between, right? So this is actually the way we format the UIDs, and that way we are able to have something looking exactly like this, right? So this will be our recovery code, and if you check from what we downloaded, this is how most of them were actually structured. They're just a bunch of UUIDs basically reformatted. All right, so once we have the code generated, we want to destroy user existing recovery codes. The point of this is that a user can only have 16 recovery codes at once, right? So if, for example, you generate a new one, we are going to remove the existing 16 codes and just give to him like 16 new codes, right? So that way, you always have like 16 codes all the time. Okay, so we are using this. So you can use the delete many method to basically remove all the code that the user basically have. This is just us removing the entire thing, right? So we generate it. The one we just generated is a new code we just generated. We remove existing code, and then we insert this generated code. This is actually an array of data, right? So this array of user ID codes. So you can use the insert many method to basically impute those array, because what this will do it's going to create many entries at once. That's what insert many does. It creates like multiple entries at the same time by using this specific command. Okay, so with this, we can be able to bulk create recovery codes. And yeah, I think this works. And the other thing I think is very important, I'm going to go back to the route, is we get recovery code for signing. Okay, so in getting the recovery code for signing, what we normally do is we call the server action. We're going to go in here. We'll put in the email, we'll put in the code. But what this function does is we want to get the status of the recovery code on signing, right? So we do this, we check if it does not exist, we just return false, right? So if the recovery code is valid, we want to return true. But if it is not, we want to return false. This is what this little piece of server action will do. All right, I think, and lastly, we have the get all user recovery codes. What this does is that it's just going to return the entire list of both active and inactive recovery codes for that user. So when you open up the server action, you can see the find basically returns everything for that user. If there is results, it's just going to return everything. But if there is no results, it's just going to bulk create and return those. So this way, we can always be rest assured that whenever this route is hit, there's always going to be some level of results. Okay, so I think with this, we've come to the end of the route part of things, the server part of things. We can actually go straight into the actual front-end implementation now. And I think I will just start from going through the login to the register, I think. Maybe the register to the login and then to the dashboard. So I think that way we can be able to cover more grounds in the shortest possible time. Okay, so this is how we basically will be handling the registration part of things. And why this is important is the fact that it's a layout, right? So the layout is pretty easy. We can go to register instead. You can see the layout we have here. It's a combination of the form and this kind of, layout on the side, right? So what we're going to do is going to just do comment this out. If I comment this out, you're going to see this becomes white. There's nothing there because the entire content powering the form is within the registered form component. Right, so I'm just going to open this up. Okay, before that, I think I need to explain to you how I worked on this part for the UI. So now this is actually an image, so it's hidden for small screens. So when I try to resize it this way, you can see that the image is gone. Right, so because this is what the hidden class does for Tailwind. Right, so it's hidden on small devices, but from large devices, will show the block form, right? So this is it. We already have the auth large. This is in /images /auth large. Go to public images, then auth large. This is it right here. That's that image. So we're extending this way. We're passing some alternate tests just in case we're unable to display the image. The alternate test should be able to come up. Right, so we want to make sure that the image actually span through the entire height of the screen. So we'll pass in the H screen here, if you see. So if I take this off, by the way, it's going to have a different structure, I think. Here you can see that it now has a different structure, which is not what we want. So if I put it back, it's going to become more concise, and you can see that the scrollers is gone. We don't need those vertical scrollers anymore. Okay, so we want the form to be able to grow as large as possible. That's why we have the flex grow here, right? So that's why it's very important. If we take that off, it's going to, the size of the form is going to be very much the same with what we have here. So if we enlarge it, you can see that the form doesn't grow by any means, right? So to make the form grow, basically have to use the flexgrow class. What this does under the hood is just setting flexgrow to 1, right? Which is a flex element, by the way. Okay, so now with that, we can actually go to register form, close the res. Okay, so in the register form, we are using Zod for our validation. So the good thing is we're using both the input validation we have, for the server side. We're still using the same input validation to validate on the client side. So that way, we're actually using similar validation for two different things, which makes sense. Okay, so now we basically set the loading class, we instantiate a router, and we basically use the use form hook coming from formic. And this form basically takes in the full name, takes in the email, as well as the password, right? So the resolver will be part of the form schema, right? So form schema is same thing as the create user input validation, right? So if you don't want to specify this, you can as well just paste this in directly, right? So I always like to separate this because it makes it much more readable, compared to not doing it this way. All right, so now we already know what we are looking at. We have the onSubmit handler. So what the onSubmit handler is doing is trying to make an API call service. This is what I explained earlier. So this API call service takes in the URL as well as the options, right? So the option is the combination of method, body, and so on. But the URL is the endpoint you want to communicate with. All right, so now this is our options, method, body. So this is the post. We want to make a register, passing our data here. So if everything is successful as expected, we want to use the toast. So by the way, the toast is coming from use toast. Use toast is actually part of the Shadcn representation. So if you don't know what Shadcn is, you want to check the Shadcn documentation right here. So they basically have some very good components you can use and modify to suit your brand needs. So there are lots of different components here, breadcrumb, button, calendar, and so on. But what we are interested in is the toast, right? So you can go to scroll down and look for toast right there. So now if I click on add to calendar, for example, you can say we have a little toast coming up at the bottom right. So this is the toast we'll be using. If you want to install it, you can come in here and do npx shadcn UI at latest add toast. This is going to add the toast component to your application. So what I normally do, even if I have it installed, I have to go to the UI folder under my component and look for the toast. Yeah, from here I can actually modify it to suit what I want in terms of coloring and stuff like that. So this is actually an inbuilt component that you can actually modify to to whatever, right? You can actually come in here and pass in bg red, right? So you can do this freely, right? So it's not like some components you want to override the styles globally. You have to be careful for you not to override the actual core things. But this you don't need to worry about stuff like that because you can. This is actually within your application. When you are pushing the code, you are pushing these changes as well, right? Which makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to undo that. Go back to the register form. So we already know how we toast out events, right? So if it's successful, we toast out, registration is successful, then we return this as the description, right? We return this as the actual description. All right, so this is exactly how we handle the functionality in the register form, right? So let's talk about the actual UI. So now we basically come in here. So we have a kind of class. It's called hello. You can see it here. It's a paragraph, and we have sign up to get started right here. So this is just taking some text styles like this, right? So text of 1.6 rem, font 700 or font bold. So the same thing, take this coloring and so on. So what we are doing here is to be able to draft in our form. So this form will be coming from the form component from Shadcn, right? So form component should be around here, right? So come in here to form, go to the solution guide and add it this way. So this is the way you add it. So you come in here, you have access to your form, you have access to all of these guys, and then we have the form field and stuff like that. So I think from the looks of it, we have the full name, we have the email, and then we have the password, right? So we have full name, email, and password. So all these forms are self-validating, right? Given the fact that if there seems to be any form of message or whatever, we use the form message to display those. So if you notice, whenever there's some sort of validation error like this, the component that's responsible for this is the form message. So if I take this off by any means, we're going to lose track of that. So I've taken it off. When I try to click on register, you can see there's no longer a form message. I don't get the error anymore. That's why it's extremely important for you to include it there. So this will be the form message. Okay, similar thing for the email, right? So you can come in here, and some people might be wondering how I actually did here. I was able to add the email icon on the left side. This is it. You can just, the input takes in the start icon. You can just put in that the start icon you need is email. That should put that there for you. Similarly, the start icon I need here is the user. That's why we have this user icon. I think the same thing applies for the password. I just put in some sort of key or whatever that is, padlock, to get here. Right, so these are the ways you can be able to control your input as well as style them up properly. Right, so you can actually use Tailwind to modify the height, like the way we are doing for all of the input. This is actually the approved height we're using all around, and we'll make sure that the width is full, and we have a kind of rounded large for each of the borders. That allows us to to properly round off stuffs. Okay, so I think with this, it's very easy. We basically have a couple of other components like the register button as well as the login instead. Right, so going to open that up. Okay, so go to source, app, auth. So we've just explained the register part. So let's go to login. Okay, so as you can see from the login, the only thing we need here is very similar. We could have actually used the same layout, but that depends on how you want to approach it. But it's fine. So we have the login form. So we open this up, and there are a couple of things that might actually be important here. So in the login part, we have the email, we have the password, right? So this is the email, we validate it here, and this is the password, right? So you can as well, yeah, so this same thing, we already have it, I think, in the comment. We already have something similar. We could use this one as well. This is it, right? We can just use this. Okay, go to the login form. You don't need to create a new one. You can just use that. Let's import it. Good. So you can use the login schema. You don't need to define a new schema representation. So this same schema is used on the server part of things. So we can still use the same thing in the in the client side. Okay, so we started our router, set up our form, set up our loading states, and so on. So now there are a couple of important things I need to point out here, right? So a couple of them, and this revolves around a little bit of complexity we have here. So I think we have the show password, hide password, and when we try to log in, we try to make reference to our architecture once more, right? So if you are logging in, so what I'm going to do this now. Put it on this side. Put it on this side. Good. All right, so when you log in, it takes in the email, password, and this is a good thing, right? So this is where we basically want to demo the entire process. So on submit, it's going to set the state to loading. The first thing we do, we check if the password is a valid recovery code, right? How we do that is that we make an API call service to this endpoint, right? So this endpoint, we already have it, is a put request. We pass in the email as well as the password as code to this endpoint. So it's going to return a boolean, right? The data part is going to return a boolean of either true or false. So if it is true, that means this recovery code, that the password enters is an actual recovery code, and the user can proceed to login, right? So that's what that means. So if it is yes, the user can proceed to login right here. But if it is no, on the other end, we want to just check if the user basically has 2FA setup, right? By calling this, make an API call service to this and check if the user has 2FA factor setup. So check the status. If the status is true, right, we want to open a 2FA authorization mode, right? So let me demo this real quick. Going to enter maybe my password here, login. Okay, so I think I should just restart my server and try it again. Okay, so this is the 2FA authorization model. So yeah, so if the 2FA response coming from the backend is saying that, oh, the status is active, that means that user already has 2FA setup. We want to bring out this model. So this model allows the user to be able to impute his OTP, 6-digit OTP from his authenticator app like Google Authenticator or Authy, right? So if we have this model, you're going to scroll to the bottom. This is what will happen, right? So we want to send this. We have a login to FA model. This takes in the email, the password, the open, and set open. So if you open this up, it I think it has a couple of things, right? So it has a couple of this stuff, and I'm going to explain how this works critically. Okay, so this is what we have, and yeah, so what we're going to do, we're going to pop up this modal, and within this modal component, it has a couple of things that I might want to point out. So for this input, which makes sense, this input is actually, I think I'm using the React OTP input, right? So React OTP input, you can actually just install this to be able to use this input, right? So, and also I kind of control the active state of this button to say that, okay, if the length of this input is not up to 6, you know, to set, set the disable to, to false, right? Set disable to true, I think, right? So if the length of the OTP input is equal to 6, then set disable to false. If it is not, set it to true. All right, so that makes sense. And also, there are a couple of other things I would like to point out. So we basically have some things that I'm managing, like the loading state, and I'm calling this endpoint, if you see. So this endpoint now is actually responsible for checking the 2FA status of the user, right? So we have using the put request. So what the put request does is we pass in the token, we pass in the email, right? So if it's actually verified, it's going to make an actual call to the DB, right? So to the server. So now if it's verified is true, we're just going to make a login request and get the response from there and set our token and redirect to home, right? So let's put in some wrong value and try to submit. You can see we have invalid OTP. Try again, right? So activate. You can see we have invalid OTP. Try again. So this is exactly how it works if you see it, and then we need to be able to put in the right OTP to be able to, gain access. I'm going to log in. I'm going to grab my OTP from my Authenticator app. Okay, so what I see here is 472.409 and activate. Okay, boom, I'm able to access my actual application. I can see that I have 16 recovering codes, I have 15 valids, I've only used one. Right, so this is me being able to access my account. I'm going to log out again. And so this is actually the core logic responsible for the dialogue, right? So anything you want to do here, you basically need to pay attention to some of the API calls you are making. Well, first of all, we check if, we try to verify that token against that user's email. And then we'll then actually, if everything works as expected, we'll log in the user. Okay, so I think with that, we've come to the end of the login point of things. And the user can just, log in from there. All right, so now we have to move into some critical aspect of things. And that has to do with the dashboard, right? So I'm going to go to dashboard, close this up, go to dashboard. Dashboard, we have page.tsx, and then we have the layout, right? So the page.tsx is responsible for what we want to display on the actual dashboard. You can see here, the only thing we need on the dashboard. So let me quickly log in again. Okay, so the things we need on the dashboard is a couple of things, and we just need a name and being able to grab all this information for the user. So now we have the logout event and the logout. So on logout, I just click local storage and redirect the user to back to the login page. Right, should we demo that? I'm going to demo that. So you can see, when I click on the inspect, go to your application, go to storage, go to local storage. So you can see we already have a token. This token is what we are using to authorize every request, I think. That way we are able to know that, oh, we're making a request with this actual token and belongs to a specific user. So now, immediately I click on logout, this token is going to wipe out, right? So I click on logout, you can see that token is gone. We no longer have that token in local storage anymore, right? So I'm gonna log in again. Okay, so now we're logged in, and the important things that powers this page are available in the dashboard content section, right? So yeah, so basically have a couple of things here that I might want to explain, right? So I'm going to go from top to bottom. So we made all the necessary imports. So we'll come in here, we have user metric. So we can see we have some icons here that we want. So these are all the icon path specified, right? So I just created an array of object that contains all of this information. So we can be able to pass in a couple of things. All right, so yeah, so top to bottom. So we basically have an array of objects that we're using to visualize what we have here, right? So you can see the icon path, you can see the title, as well as the count, right? So if you fetch all the recovery codes, we basically have, so first of all, when this component mounts, right? So when it mounts, we want to fetch the user profile, and then we want to get the recovery codes as well, right? We'll get the 2FA status as well as the recovery codes. So to get the recovery codes, we hit the /API/recovery codes endpoint. So this will be responsible for giving us all the recovery codes. So I'm going to check the network tab real quick. Okay, so yes, that's exactly how the logout will work for the most part. And when we have the recovery codes, just going to go to the network tab and click on here and go to network. So this is we fetching recovery codes. No, that's status. Yes, so this is actually list This is a bunch of our 16 pieces of recovery code. So you can see they all have the active status. So just to mention, the active status here, if it says false, that means it is still very much, active, it has not been used. But if it's active set to true, that means it has been used actually. So which is like a weird analogy. You may want to do the opposite, as the case may be. Right. So this is exactly how you play around with getting the list of recovery codes. So when we get the list of recovery codes from here, we set it over to the state here with using the set recovery codes method, right? So we set it over to this, then we don't have access to recovery codes. So from here we can now do, let's get the length to be able to know all the recovery codes. Here to get all the valid ones, the ones that are still very much, valid, and use codes, the ones that have actually been used. So we can use this little filter to get all the ones that has been used. So this is actually the structure of the user metric that we see on this UI representation right here. And I think the other important part that I need to mention is the way the remove 2FA works and also the recovery codes model. So let's worry about remove 2FA. So when you click on this, so I'm going to scroll to the bottom. So we have the remove 2FA. So this is it. So the remove 2FA is actually within this component. So it's a trigger within this component. So when you click on it, it's going to trigger the 2FA remover model. So I'm going to open that up. And so it's going to open up this. So it's going to have the text two-factor authentication remover, and it's going to have a couple of texts right here. Right. So you can say two-factor authentication enhances the security of your account, and you need to be able to check out for major things at the required time, right? So basically have two-factor security app strongly advises maintaining two-factor authentication enabled for your account. If you need to modify your settings or generate new codes, you can accomplish this within the dashboard section, right? So this is the way we basically like take notes of the things. And then when you click on there's an action here, this remove 2FA is actually a method. So when you click on it, it's going to make a call to the /API/2FA. If you notice the method, it's a delete. So this means that the user wants to remove 2FA from his account. So when I do that now, remove 2FA and log out, I try to log in again with my password. It's not going to ask me for anything that has to do with 2FA. So I log in. You can see I have direct access to my account now without needing to set up 2FA or anything. Okay, that is good. Very good. So this is how we use this modal to basically explain that, right? And we can come here. For example, you want to set up, right? So like the way we have it now, you want to set up 2FA for the first time. You want to click on this button. So instead of having 2FA remover modal, you get to see the 2FA setup modal. So I'm going to open up the 2FA setup modal. And in here, what is important is very similar with 2FA remover modal, just that we are making a series of calls to different endpoints. So when I click on it, it's going to basically generate a setup key for you, which you will need, right? And this setup key will be responsible for generating the 6-digit key you need subsequently. All right, so now we basically generate this code. So we want to go through how this code was generated, right? So what we'll do is to basically start from the get-go. So I'm going to close out the remaining part. And now we basically have some states we're using to manage a couple of things here. And so now we call this endpoint to be able to, generate 2FA. So I'm just going to put this on the side and put this secondly. Okay. So this code now can only be generated once. So if we already have it generated, we just return the existing one, right? So we don't want to duplicate that by any means. So if we have the setup key, right, which we already do in this case, and the next thing we do is we have the OTP, React OTP input to be able to validate the user's input against the secret key, right? So how we do that, it's very easy. We have undo initial call. We call this function. We'll go straight to this one, right? So we get the 12A status, right? No, not really, not really. So let's scroll down to where we have intersect digit. So we have the set OTP, we have the verified 12A token. Good, good, good. So this is exactly what I was pointing at. So what we do, we have this little logic. We use this logic to, first off, we set this, the loading state to true. We make a request to this endpoint to be able to generate, to be able to verify 12A token. Right, it's a put request, so we verify 12A token. And if you don't know where that is, it's actually API 12A route. So check the put, which is verified 12A token, which is right there. So verify 12A token right here. And this will just try to verify the token for us. Okay, so once we have that, we want to set loading state back to false, and we want to maybe re-render the component so that we can have the updated state in terms of here, right? So we want to be able to render this component so that this setup will change to remove 2FA instead, right? So let's try to set it up now. I'm just going to, scan this QR code. Okay, so I have that scanned. I want to do 426 242, right? So activate. So now you can see that I made a lot of changes here, and the most important part is we're trying to make all these renders here, I think, right? So this set this render privacy component is responsible for that, right? So this render, it can be anything, to be honest, right? So it can just be render component or whatever. So you can come in here and let's check wherever we're using 2FA setup. Okay, so we're using this within the dashboard section, and you can see this undo refresh. So what this is doing is just to basically undo refresh. So let's change all of this to undo refresh. So it's very easy. Yeah, it's very easy to understand. So this will just undo refresh for, say, the actual parent component and stuff like that. So we have a render parent and the refresh. It does the same thing, to be honest. So yeah. So yeah, that way we can be able to re-render, and then we have access to this new updated column, right? So yeah, this basically explains how we handle this. If we want to remove, and click on that, click on the remove part. This will hit the delete endpoint and remove the 2FA. All right, so that being said, the other most important section of this application has to do with recovery codes. When they click on recovery code, we want to open up this modal and show the user all the available recovery codes, both the used and the unused, right? So let's go to recovery code modal and scroll to the top, add a sidebar. Okay, and there we go, right? So what we are doing here, we want to create a little bit of canvas. This is more of a UI stuff, I would say. So you can see this button is responsible, the recovery codes will be responsible for the triggering, and then we have this title right here. We have this title here. Then we have this lets you alert. This is it. We're using Shadcn alert. If you don't know where that is, go to Shadcn documentation, go to alert. This is it. Right. So just basically have to style it to match your particular implementation. And also we want to be able to install. So for you to install it, you want to do npx Shadcn -ui at latest, add alert. So this will allow you to be able to add the alert, as part of your dependencies. Not really as part of your components, right? So this will be available in the UI directory. All right. So now we have the recovery code. So recovery code is, I think this is a separate component. I'm just going to open it up. Yeah, so this is actually a separate component that consists of all of this. So it has some sort of border, I think. So this is the border right here. So for you to know where I'm pointing at, this is this border covering the entire thing. So I can just use maybe border red 400 here or 600. So this one, let's see. All right, so you can see this is the border I was really pointing out. So that's a lot. Let's see border right there. We're going to undo it. Good. So this is the border we have, and this will be responsible. So what I'm doing here, I'm trying to get the first 8 here, and then I'll get the last 8 here. All right. So this is the first time you dot slice to get the first 8 item of the array, and I'm using dot slice to basically just get the last 8 as well. Right. So basically have a little bit of badge. Right. We have a success badge. We have the warning badge. So this success badge is this one. The warning or error badge will be this. Right. So we're actually using some conditional to render each of the path depending on the active state of the recovery code. So the same thing applies here. Same thing we do for the last 8, right? And also, when you go back, what is actually very technical is the way we handle copy, print, and download, right? So we're going to go up here and maybe scroll down a bit. So you can see we have print. We have print here. We have download here. So we have download here, I think. So we have download. We have print. And then we have copy. So what I'm going to do to make you guys understand it better, I'm going to try to explain each of these logic, each of the logic, basically powering every little feature here, right? So let's start with download, this one. Okay, so if you click on download, it triggers the undo download function. So this undo download is going to set the loading state to true. It's going to basically format the codes just to get like the core codes and not the entire recovery code object, right? So we want to download array as text file, right? So I've already created a small function here that allows us to create like a blob representation and being able to create a URI onto that block. So now think of it this way: we just create a link tag, yeah. So and then we create a new instance of a blob, and we specify the type as plain. And what we want to do is that this element we already have, we want to give it like an href of this new blob we just created, and want to give it a name, right? So we can use the element to download. This is going to be the download name. So if I download now, the name you see, 2FA security codes, is what you have here, 2FA security codes.txt, right? And you want to do document.body.append child, that's the element. So that's to say that whatever we create, right, whatever document we create here, we're going to append the child to this particular element. So if you notice, your element is what you just created right here. This is your element, and we want to make sure this data array is being passed in. So remember, data array is an array of string, and we're just joining everything in with a new line. So if you open it up, you notice that everything is going to the next line. So this is because we are using the /n within here. So that's why we are able to push everything down the line, and we're going to be able to have each of the codes on separate lines. All right, so now we are able to do that, and at the end we basically have this ECT function of passing the codes, and then we will be able to have a little pop-up to download the text file. When we are done, we want to set the download loading state to back to false. Okay, so this is how you basically undo the download as a doc text file, right? So now the next one is print. So when you're printing, we have a print recovering code component. to basically handle this, right? So we have a trigger button component. So let me open the print component. So this is it. So the way it works is we are going to basically use some sort of React Native and React DOM server instance, I think, right? So we're using this to basically render to string the content we have. So the content we want to print, if you notice, the content we want to print is this one, the recovery code. Recovery code is just a component that contains all of this. We want to print everything here, right? So go back here. So now we want to just create a window. Want to open up a window with width 600, height 600, and we want to write to this window, right? So we have it open like this. And the next thing is for us to write some sort of HTML into the opened window. So the way we do that, we can actually use the document.write to be able to write this content in. And the good thing here is that we have the HTML string. The HTML string is what we're able to derive by using the React DOM server to render to string. They will pass in the content to basically print, right? So this one will basically write into within this div, right? So to write, okay, in between the div, like starting div and the ending div right here, right? So it's just like normally the way you write some sort of content within your actual page. That's the same thing you would do at this stage, right? So you just have to write them one point at a time, right? So at the end, when you're done with the entire write, you want to be able to close it at this stage, right? So you can actually use the document.close to close the document. And once you have the document closed, you want to print it, right? So there are lots of things going on here. So you first of all, you open the document, you write into it, you close that document, you then print the closed document, and then finally you close the entire thing. So it makes sense to basically understand what you are opening and what you are closing. So in here we are just focusing on the document, but in here we are focusing on the window. So you will print the window, then we'll close the printed window. Right, so I think with this, you can have a better grasp of how the handle prints will work for the most part. All right, so and finally we have the copy. Copy is basically very simple. We are using React copy to clipboard package to handle the copy to clipboard, and you just put in the text you want to, obviously copy. And we want to align, like, okay, if we were copying this text, in what format or mode do we want to copy it in, right? So we want for each code to basically have this /n to the next line, right? So if, for example, I copy it this way and I go to any notepad and paste it in, you can see that I copied it in the very cool manner that every code is individually on the next line. This is possible because of using the .join and /n, kind of directive right there. So that's how we're able to copy it and do stuff. So yeah, I think with this, we've actually explained how a lot of this work. So if, for example, you feel like you want to regenerate new code, this actually calls for this last part of the command, right? So this one. So we have a generate new recovery codes. Right, so let's take a look at how this works. Right, so we have, first of all, we're managing the states. So if say loading to true, we try to make some calls. So if you notice, this is actually a post request, right? No, don't get it wrong. This is a post request. So a post request to /API/recovery code is going to generate a new, it's going to actually do a bulk generation of 16 new pair of codes, right? So that way it removes existing code and just gives us like a new one, right? So that way everything becomes new. So if you notice, we handle initial call. Handle initial call is like to get a recovery code and stuff like that. So immediately I click on generate new codes, now it's going to hit this endpoint and it's going to fetch all the recent new recovery codes as well. So it's going to first of all generate and fetch everything again. So if I hit it, that's why you see it like real time, everything works perfectly. So generate, trying to generate now. Generate, we can see we have new code. Generate. You can see we have new codes all the time, right? So that way we don't want to, run into collisions and stuff like that. So all the codes you generate will always be distinct. And for the most part, they are just, new codes assigned to your users. Okay, so I'm just going to, you can generate as much code as you want, right? So, but now what I want to do is to go through this to make sure that we're actually on point with everything, right? We need to close this out, close this out. And so I felt that there were some utilities that were extremely important that I did not cover previously, right? So we have call utilities like this, right? So whenever I am actually working on a full stack app with Next, I normally just, write my error handlers as well as handlers for success responses and so on, right? So as you can see here, we have the handle error. You can actually use this to handle your error. So first of all, you check if the error is an instance of the error, a JavaScript error, right? So if it is, basically you want to throw a new error, right? So you want to see if the error is actually of type string. If it is, you want to return that and so on. So you notice that this is actually like moving in circles for the most part. But something I do much more elegantly is I try to not stick with this approach, but then I create my own success response and error response. The way this works is even if it's actually an error like this, we get a message, right? So we have a message, we have a code or the status code for that error, and then we have the data, right? So if you want to pass in anything coming from the error or whatever, we want to pass in data, but most of the time it can just be null. Or if you need, we kind of want to provide some sort of specifics, you want to attach an actual value to the data attribute, right? So now this is actually the structure of the response, right? So we have the meta field and then we have the data field. This same thing applies for the success response as well, which I will explain in a bit. So in the meta field, we have the success and then we have the message. So success is actually false for error, and the message can actually be anything you want to pass in as your message, right? So we at the end of the day, we just return the next response.json. Then we pack in the response there. That's this response object as well as the status code, right? So remember, we are taking the status code from the client, right? So that way we can be able to, properly map the error. Most of the part, if you check our several actions, we are using this to basically emit out relative errors. So the same thing applies for success. The message for success can actually be changed, but by default, it just returns success. Then we'll pass in any form of data that we want to pass in, then pass in the code. Right, so we do something very similar. You can check the structure of the response here. It's very similar with what we have in the error response, right? So it takes in the meta object. Meta object takes in the success and then takes in the message. So success is true for success response, and the message can be anything you passed in here, right? So white data on the other end is the data that you want to return to your client, right? So depending, so you basically want to return some sort of JSON data or stuff like that. So but then we are using the next response, the JSON, to wrap this alongside the status code. This way we can have a proper object or JavaScript object as our response. Okay, so now I think I've been able to explain the success response and the error response, right? So one of those things I think is very vital is our use of the bounds. We didn't actually use search or whatever, but I think it's very important to explain this just for those guys that want to implement the bounds in one way or another. So if you have probably like a search form or something related, the bounds allows you to not be making requests every second, right? So for you to be able to put in some space between making your request to the actual backend, you basically need to leverage something like the bounds, and then you specify your delay, right? You can specify like 300 milliseconds delay or 500, depending on how you want to do it. So this is actually a core utility. I think it's very present in most of the projects I work on. All right, so there we go. We can basically have another token. I think I've already explained this. This is where we validate our token. And if you notice, we pass in a token as well as a secret right to it. So this has already been explained before. It just gives you a proper idea of how that should be. Okay, so yeah, we basically need to, in cases where you want to ellipsify a string or something related, and I just use this function. So specify the length. That means how long do you want your piece of text to be before you can add those dot 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 or whatever. In some cases, they just use asterisks, but I think this is actually relatively optional. So depending on how you want to approach it, so you can just specify, what is needed in that order. Yes, so I think with this, I've been able to explain the utility part of things, right? So validations, I've explained this before, which makes sense. We just have the create user input validation, as well as the login user input validation, right? So, so let's go back to the types. Yes, so yeah, I think there's something I didn't cover. So the types are actually, we're using TypeScript to basically just type, our responses for the backend and stuff like that. So this, for example, is I create user response. So this is actually a typical response you'll be getting from the backend when you create a user. So this is how it's typed. So you can be able to do response, the meta, what do we have in meta, the success, the message, like that. So this gives you, much more flexibility on how you want to be able to successfully interact with your actual backend, right? With your actual backend. And yeah, quite precisely, we still have, I think, responses for a couple of other things. So we have responses for iLogin user response. This would be a typical response for, for when you log in, when you hit the login endpoint. And also we have the I2FA response. This is a typical response for, for two-factor authentication. It returns the user ID, returns the secret, returns the status, as well as the timestamp. So we'll still have like recovery code status check response. This will return a very typical response because I think the data here is just true or false, right? So that is particularly self-explanatory. And then we have the high user profile response. So high user profile response on the other end returns something similar like this. So what it does return is the high user profile response data, which contains email and the full name, as well as the timestamp. Okay, so then we have iUser's listing response. So listing response is we already know how the user structure is. So, but then when you list, you want to return an array of the user data, right? So this is what we are doing here. This means that we're going to return an array of this guy, right? So whatever we have here, there's going to be an array of it. Okay, so I think with this actually just sums up the entire thing. And yeah, I think the other part that is very relevant has to do with the Tailwind configurations, right? So in the Tailwind config, we basically, set up a couple of things like in terms of color, right? So this is actually, when you do text color, BG, like text primary, BG primary, and so on, this is how it's configured. So under your colors tab, this color is under extended, right? Which is on that theme, right? So we have theme, we have extended inside theme, we have extend inside theme, then we have the colors inside of extend. So this is where you paste all your colors into, and then within your actual client code, you can be able to access these colors by doing text primary, text dark, and so on, right? So this gives a proper idea of how that works. So if you want to do maybe body radius, you want to do something similar this way, you just want to do whatever. So this can actually be anything. It can actually be, you can just put something here, BR red or BR small, something like that. So you can specify maybe like 12 pixel. Just make sure that it's actually in a string. Yeah, so this is how you can actually use rounded BRSM. Right, so this will just work by default. So the same thing applies to if you want to use like width, right? Maybe width, you want to use height. If you want to use, if you want to use maximum width and so on. So the same thing applies, right? So for example, you want to use a width of maybe 200 pixel. Yeah, so this should just work for you. And it's a paste that's in correctly. Yeah, so this should just work for you for your width. So in here now, you can go to maybe your client code. Let's do an example. You can come in here and do width 200. You can see that the 200 is appearing as needed. So you can see width 200 pixels. Right, so similarly, this is the way you can play around a couple of other attributes as well, not just this, but lots and lots of them. Right, so I'm just going to undo all of this and push all the final changes, and then we can wrap it up. So I'm going to check all these changes I've made. Login form. Okay, good. So I'm going to just push all these changes. Okay, so these are actually all the changes. I'm just going to push them all in so you guys can actually have access to all of this in the actual repo. I think this should be updated now. I'm just going to refresh it. Okay, good. We just made those update. So yeah, I think with this we can actually okay, I think with this we've actually come to the end of this presentation, right? Let me know what you think. If there are other kind of feature you want included, I might really just do a part 2 of this. It depends on the feedback. Yeah, thank you all for joining. I'll catch you in the next one.